sort of experience or the prospect of having to go and physically pledge our gold with the Bank of England in order to get temporary standby access to foreign exchange before we negotiated the IMF loan. That compared with that, it was said that look at the state of our foreign exchange reserves, the size of our foreign exchange reserves, and this is a reflection of the degree to which this growth trajectory, they of course don't call it neoliberal, has been successful. Now what do we have today? What we have today is, of course, it's not that we are in a situation where these foreign exchange reserves have been wiped out, but what we have is a continuous now, for a significant period of time, a continuous widening of the deficit on that balance of payments. When the 1991 crisis occurred, a 3% relative to GDP current account deficit was seen as being responsible for the crisis. We are now talking about current account deficit to GDP ratios in excess of 5%, close to 6%. Therefore, we have this huge and widening deficit. The consequence is an obvious weakening of the rupee, and a weakening of the rupee which, though it is being attributed to actually foreign capital now pulling out, if you look at the evidence, it might be true that in the first 10 days of June, some foreign capital went out of this country, but in May, when a large part of the depreciation or the decline of the rupee occurred, that you actually had a significant inflow of foreign capital into the country. That is, just the inflow of foreign capital, which this strategy had managed to ensure, is not even enough to keep the rupee safe, and that is because of the fact that no more is that amount of foreign capital adequate to actually give you a surplus above what is needed to finance the deficit in your balance of payments. That is, we need to keep this capital coming, as the finance minister put it in his budget speech this year. We need to keep this capital coming in, now not to shore up our reserves, but just in order to be able to finance the excess of our foreign exchange expenditures relative to our receipts. Now the implication of that, of course, is not merely that you're stuck in a situation where you're virtually, seized with panic about the behavior of foreign finance, so much so that we've become so subservient to the rating agencies, which are rating agencies which we know were completely discredited during the financial crisis. We're very unhappy when Moody's or Standard & Poor more recently puts us on negative outlook. And yesterday we were very happy because of the fact that Fitch Ratings has said that, okay, we're putting you on stable outlook. But basically it reflects the deep fear that not only would we not keep receiving capital to finance this growing deficit, but we'd actually end up with a situation where we begin to see a reverse flow of that legacy capital which sits with the Reserve Bank of India now as its foreign exchange reserves, and that would actually start a cumulative process that can precipitate a very major crisis of the kind that many countries have seen, and in particular Southeast Asia saw in 1997. So therefore we have a deep crisis of that regime of development in many senses, which is visible. Now, this is of significance because experience has taught us that there are two directions in which we can go. Experience has taught us that after an early entry into the world of neoliberalism, Latin America saw the coming of neoliberalism in the early 1970s. In 1973-75, the southern countries in Latin America, Chile and so on, under the Chicago Boys, went in and started this process of actually launching on this kind of a neoliberal trajectory. Okay? And if you look at it, as far as they were concerned, that trajectory resulted in a complete loss of economic opportunity, what first people called a lost decade, and then it became two lost decades for Latin America. And what has happened there is we now see that because of that experience, that recognition of the kind of damage which this kind of strategy can impose, in a number of countries, in Brazil, in Argentina, in Chile to a certain extent, in Bolivia and Ecuador, in many countries, we see that there is a shift which is occurring and an effort to try and experiment with alternative policy regimes in order to be able to reduce the dependence on foreign capital and find alternative ways of having a more democratic path of development, which is more egalitarian, more better in terms of its distributed content. So one way in which a crisis can lead, of course, in Latin America's case, after 2 decades long wait, it could move in the direction of trying to find yourself an alternative which goes beyond the kind of outcomes that neoliberalism delivers. But the other can be collapse and complete chaos. We only have to go to the peripheral countries of Europe and look at what is happening there, where it is obvious who generated the crisis, it is obvious what kind of policies were responsible for the crisis. In the first instance, you responded to the crisis by trying to actually do something about it, by bringing the state in, by increasing public expenditure, by actually putting in more liquidity into the system. But today we see that the only alternative which people are speaking of, independent of the fact that it has become very clear that it's a total failure, those countries are just going down the drain, countries like Portugal, countries like Greece, and even Ireland and so on, then what you're actually observing is that the only solution which is being currently spoken about as far as the state is concerned in those countries is one of austerity. That you have to find, I mean, you must have read in today's papers, you even want to close down the public broadcasting agency because of the fact that you want to save a few, 1,000+ jobs in order to be able to meet these targets, which partly have been forced to accept, but partly the financial elite has sort of pressured the state into accepting in those countries as well. So that could be the other direction, and that could lead to some of the consequences which Professor Patnaik was talking about in terms of the possibilities of a kind of tendency towards a 21st century form of fascism in a late industrializing underdeveloped country like India. Now therefore, the fact that this crisis occurs is not merely something to recognize and perhaps to say that, at last we know that all this talk of India shining, of Bharat Nirman and so on is not going to work, that we have a crisis at hand, but it also is a major challenge. It either can give us an opportunity to find social sanction through the electoral process to experiment with new alternatives, or it can actually lead to a situation where we are staring down an abyss in which what could happen is more reform and austerity, and therefore a far greater degree of suffering for much of the population with deep social and political consequences. Now, I think this is to sort of emphasize this. I want to say the reason why I think that this crisis is not just a blip in the sort of graph of post-1991 Indian capitalism is because there were a certain set of features of that neoliberal trajectory. One, of course, was a feature which all of us constantly refer to, is an element of market fundamentalism, where you speak of the glories, I mean, or the benevolence of the market, but really use that as a sort of as a shield, a slogan, to be able to push for the unfettered operation of private capital. The second is you speak of the need for a minimalist state, which does not intervene too much because market forces must be allowed to play their role, which then becomes actually the veil which you use to cover up the fact that neoliberalism, as many like David Harvey and so on have pointed out, is a class project in which what you're trying to do is actually shift the distribution of income and surplus in dramatic forms away from the large mass of the population in favor of a few. And therefore, if, for example, you look at supposedly the most privileged sector of Indian capitalism, which is the organized manufacturing sector, the registered manufacturing sector, between 2003 or 2002 and 2008, which is the period in which we saw the celebration of this trajectory in terms of very high growth rates. If you look at value added, which as possibly value added consists of the sum total of profits, rents, and interest and wages. And if you look at this combination of profit, wages, rent, and interest, and if you look at the share of profits and value added in the registered manufacturing sector, where workers are supposed to be more organized, have the ability to be able to defend their rights and so on, you find that in this short period, the share of profits to value added moved up something like 24% to 62%. That is the degree to which there has been a sort of complete effort to shift the distribution of income and wealth in favor of a few, which constitutes the class project which neoliberalism is. And finally, of course, we know that in doing this, the way in which growth has been sustained is to use the liquidity which comes from the international system by opening your economic borders to generate a growth path in which, unlike in the past, where public expenditure, of course, to a certain extent, deficit financed public expenditure, and the home market, an effort to develop the home market, constituted the basis for growth. What you saw in the period after the late 1990s is that the stimuli for growth essentially consisted in debt-financed private expenditure, both in terms of consumption expenditure, because we know housing investment, purchases of automobiles, purchases of durables, credit card receivables have just boomed, so that you have an increase in the ratio of debt to GDP from something like 22% right through the 1990s to 52% by the time you get to 2008. There's a huge increase in credit being provided within the system. A lot of that credit, as I said, has gone in the form of these retail advances to buy houses on credit, to buy automobiles on credit, to buy durables on credit, etc. But a lot of it has also gone to actually finance a kind of investment. The so-called investment in the infrastructural sectors as part of the public-private partnership route. So that you have a huge increase, and I don't want to tie in with numbers, in the amount of credit which has gone from the public banking system for power generation, power distribution, roads and ports, and of course civil aviation. We know who gave the money to Kingfisher Airlines, and then when they were not in a position to be able to pay, gave them even more money so that they would be able to survive and hopefully repay tomorrow. So you actually have the use of the public banking system to pump credit to support investment by the private sector as part of your privatization strategy. And most of these projects in the power sector, in the ports and roads sector, and of course in civil aviation, in hoteliering. I mean, a lot of the five-star hotels were funded as part of an supposedly tourism infrastructure on the basis of debt which came from the public banking system. So you had these three features. And this really reflected the way in which capital was trying to resolve the crisis that it had faced from the middle of the 1960s, when it no more was in a position to be able to expand and grow in India the way it did during the first decade and a half after independence. And if that was the strategy which was being adopted, this was this kind of a class project which is being adopted, it basically depends upon your ability to continue maintaining this kind of a trajectory. And what we have is evidence that no more is it possible for you, without the banking system hitting what could be a major crisis, continue this debt finance scheme of stimulating growth. So banks are pulling back, which is why you're seeing the slowdown in the automobile sector. No more is it possible for you to have use the state as an instrument to make the shift of capital, because you have managed to hand over your oil resources, your coal resources, your spectrum, anything which is available in the hands of the state as assets from which money can be made has been handed over at a low price or for nothing to the private sector. But now that's become so controversial and so much in the public eye that it becomes difficult to sustain this trajectory where you can move profits and value added from 24% to 62% in a period of 7 to 8 years. And of course, therefore, you really seem to be in a situation where this ability to be able to sustain this trajectory is under deep challenge. Now, therefore, I just want to end with the following. If then we have this crisis, which at least I am suggesting, and I'm sure possibly some of you would agree with me, is not a blip in some kind of growth map which we have, but really something which is deeper, which shows that this trajectory which was being celebrated as a success of neoliberalism in India is now, we've seen the end of it, we've seen the end of this neoliberal triumphalism. But then there are these two routes to go. And then we had Comrade Karat laying out a whole set of things which we can think of as the sort of the framework of an alternative which we have, which we've always had, and we can even flesh them out in terms of details. Many people have done that some of whom are here in this hall. And so it's not that, but it's just that there are these two ways we can go. And I think there, the real problem which we would face is the legacy which neoliberalism structurally leaves for the left. One element of that legacy, of course, is that over a period of time, in a country where in any case the organized workforce was relatively small relative to the total workforce, some say 7%, some may say even less, 4% is really the organized workforce you have, that is a country which has now moved into a trajectory in which the core capitalist sector actually puts out much of its work, its activities to areas in which you're able to exploit the large amount of unemployed and underemployed workers that you have. So therefore, what you in some sense have is that, so that we know that in country after country, when a government comes to power, which is thinking of putting in an alternative, the first threat is that, listen, foreign capital, which is accumulated in large measure within your economy, you're now talking about just the amount which is coming through the stock market being in the range of more than $150 billion accumulated over a period of time. And if that goes out over a short period of time, we know the kind of dangers, and that's only one part of it. So there is this threat which is held out, where even if you have the social sanction, there will be pressure to move down the second route, as it were. And finally, I think the real sort of the other real danger which we have is that unable in some sense to be able to mobilize or find for yourself sort of class grouping, the class formation to be able to undertake this activity. What does tend to happen is that the principal enemy to a certain extent becomes the state. You want the state to give you a food security bill, you want the state to implement an employment guarantee. That is, what's on the table is in some sense not because of something which is wrong, but because of the way in which the institutional class formation evolves, is that it becomes, a lot of it is demands vis-a-vis the state. Now this becomes problematic because there are two forces attacking the state in which case, because the right is also attacking the state. The whole talk of making corruption the central plank of an alternative is actually partly a right-wing attack of the state, against the state. It is a way of corporate capital saying, we will finance you to ensure that the state does not begin to exercise too much power, which gives whom freedom? It really gives capital freedom in large measure. And I think being, on the one hand, while having to take up these slogans and these movements because of this complex formation we are in, the need to be able to translate that at some point of time into a program which challenges the class project which neoliberalism is, and not the state project which it only is because of the coalition of capital in the state. I think that would be the last of the challenges which make this alternative extremely difficult to implement. Thank you.
നമുക്ക് ഭക്ഷണത്തിന് മുമ്പ് ഒരു 15-20 മിനിറ്റ് ചർച്ചയ്ക്കായി രണ്ട് പരസ്പര ബന്ധിതമായിട്ടുള്ള പ്രബന്ധങ്ങളാണ് ഇവിടെ അവതരിപ്പിച്ചത്. പ്രൊഫസർ പ്രഭാത് വളരെ വിശാലമായ ഒരു ക്യാൻവാസിൽ നിന്നുകൊണ്ട് ഇന്ത്യയുടെ സാമൂഹ്യ സാമ്പത്തിക രാഷ്ട്രീയ രംഗത്തിൽ വന്നുകൊണ്ടിരിക്കുന്ന മാറ്റങ്ങളെ കഴിഞ്ഞ ഒരു 10-75 വർഷത്തെ അടിസ്ഥാനമാക്കിയുള്ള ഒരു അവതരണമാണ് നടത്തിയത്. അതകത്ത് നിന്നുകൊണ്ട് ഇന്ത്യൻ സമ്പദ്ഘടനയിൽ സംഭവിച്ചുകൊണ്ടിരിക്കുന്ന മാറ്റത്തിൽ ഊന്നിക്കൊണ്ടാണ് CCP അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ പ്രബന്ധം അവതരിപ്പിച്ചിട്ടുള്ളത്. അത് പ്രധാനമായും ഇന്ത്യയിൽ കഴിഞ്ഞ 2 ദശാബ്ദങ്ങളായി നടപ്പാക്കിക്കൊണ്ടിരിക്കുന്ന നവലിബറൽ സാമ്പത്തിക പരിഷ്കാരങ്ങൾ ഒരു സാമ്പത്തിക വളർച്ച എന്ന ഒരു പ്രചാരണത്തിൽ ഊന്നിക്കൊണ്ട് ആരംഭിക്കുകയും അതുമായി ബന്ധപ്പെട്ടുകൊണ്ടുള്ള നവനിർമ്മാണം പോലുള്ള ഇന്ത്യ ശോഭിക്കുന്നു അല്ലെങ്കിൽ തിളങ്ങുന്ന ഇന്ത്യ പോലുള്ള മുദ്രാവാക്യങ്ങൾ ഇറക്കിക്കൊണ്ട് ജനങ്ങൾക്കിടയിൽ വലിയ ആവേശമുണ്ടാക്കുകയും ഘട്ടം ഘട്ടമായി ആ ഒരു ഈ സാമ്പത്തിക വളർച്ചയിൽ ഊന്നിയിട്ടുണ്ടാകുന്ന ഒരു സമീപനം തകർന്നുകൊണ്ടിരിക്കുകയും ചെയ്യുന്ന ഒരു അവസ്ഥയെക്കുറിച്ചാണ് അദ്ദേഹം സൂചിപ്പിച്ചത്. ഈ തകർച്ചയാകട്ടെ ഇന്ത്യയിലെ സാധാരണക്കാരായ ജനങ്ങളുടെ ജീവിതത്തിൽ ഉണ്ടാക്കിയിട്ടുള്ള പ്രത്യാഘാതങ്ങൾ, പ്രത്യേകിച്ചും വിലക്കയറ്റം, സ്വകാര്യവൽക്കരണം ഇതുപോലുള്ള മാറ്റങ്ങൾ ഉണ്ടാക്കുന്ന പ്രത്യാഘാതങ്ങളെ സംബന്ധിച്ചാണ് അദ്ദേഹം ചോദ്യം. ഈ സാമ്പത്തിക അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഈ ഒരു നയത്തിന്റെ ഭാഗമായി വിദേശ നാണയത്തോടുണ്ടാകുന്ന ഒരു ആർത്തിയുടെ ഭാഗമായി ഇന്ത്യയിൽ ആരംഭിച്ചിട്ടുണ്ടാകുന്ന പ്രക്രിയകളെ സംബന്ധിച്ചും വളരെ വിശദമായി തന്നെ അദ്ദേഹം സൂചിപ്പിക്കുകയുണ്ടായി. കഴിഞ്ഞ 5 വർഷമായി ലോക സാമ്പത്തിക രംഗത്ത് വന്നുകൊണ്ടിരിക്കുന്ന മാറ്റങ്ങൾ, ആ പ്രതിസന്ധിയെ എങ്ങനെയാണ് ലാറ്റിൻ അമേരിക്കൻ രാജ്യങ്ങൾ അഭിമുഖീകരിക്കുന്നത്, എങ്ങനെയാണ് യൂറോപ്പിൽ ഉണ്ടാകുന്ന ഗ്രീസ്, അയർലൻഡ് പോലുള്ള രാജ്യങ്ങൾ സമീപിക്കുന്നത്, അവർ തമ്മിലുള്ള പ്രധാനപ്പെട്ട വ്യത്യാസം എന്താണ്, അവിടെ രൂപപ്പെട്ടു വരുന്ന മൂവ്മെന്റുകളുടെ ഘടനാപരമായിട്ടുണ്ടാകുന്ന മാറ്റങ്ങൾ എന്തൊക്കെയാണ്, ഈ കാര്യങ്ങളും അതിനെ വിശദീകരിക്കാൻ ശ്രമിക്കുകയുണ്ടായി. ക്രൈസിസ് എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് മുതലാളിത്ത